to this evening's University of Notre Dame, Australia School of Law Sydney Annual Religious Liberty Lecture. And as this slide tells you, I'm Professor Michael Quinlan, so I'm the Dean of the School of Law here at Notre Dame, and since June last year and until June next year, I'm also having the great privilege of being the Acting Dean of the School of Business here, which is an absolute treat. So this year we're very pleased that Professor Daniel Peterson will be delivering our lecture. And I'd like to specifically welcome, it's always dangerous doing this, Joanne Powell-Davis from the Buddhist Council of Australia, Philip Hobby, Baulkham Hills State President, and Elder Robert Dudfield, member of the 70 of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And any other dignitaries here, the members of the Institute for Ethics and Society, members of the Law Advisory Board. I can't welcome councillors and members of the Thomas More Society because any decent members of that society will be at their Christmas party, which is on tonight, unfortunately. Visiting academics, academic colleagues, staff and students from the School of Law, and ex-students from the School of Law, and staff and students from other schools at Notre Dame. Friends all, you're all most welcome. The University of Notre Dame Australia acknowledges traditional owners of the land on which the Sydney campus is located, the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and pays respect to elders past and present. They hold the knowledge, the traditions and the culture of their peoples and their land. So this evening we gather on the eve of Red Wednesday. Red Wednesday this year is the 28th of November. For those of you who aren't familiar with Red Wednesday, it's an international initiative of aid to the church in need. And it's a day to gather and pray in solidarity with those who are persecuted and suffer unjustly for their peacefully held beliefs. It's a day when many major buildings around the world, including Westminster Parliament, Westminster Cathedral and St Mary's Cathedral here in Sydney, and even more significantly, some buildings at Notre Dame will be lit up tomorrow. And one day we might get the Sydney Opera House to light up. You know, they rarely do that, very rarely do that. Put red colour, bathe the Opera House in red colour. This was something that they were not prepared to do this year, but hopefully next year we'll do it. And all who wish to commemorate, remember and protest religious persecution around the world are encouraged to wear red tomorrow. So if you remember, wear some red tomorrow. This is the 7th annual lecture in this series. As I said in 2013 when I introduced His Eminence Cardinal George Pell, 2014 when I introduced the Honourable Senator George Brandis, who was then the Attorney General of Australia, in 2015 when I introduced Elder Quentin L. Cook of the Quorum of 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as I said in 2016 when Professor Ian Benston delivered this lecture, he's one of our laudable academics, and in 2017 when I introduced Adjunct Professor Rex Adar's address. I hope that this is the last of these lectures. I say that because I hope the continuing and pressing need to discuss religious liberty will abate. Unfortunately, each year I say the same thing, and that is that the need for this lecture only increases, and the great fear that I've expressed each year that I introduce this lecture only continues to grow. And that fear is that this lecture will be on our annual calendar for many years to come, because religious freedom continues to be under attack. In fact, since last year, the religious freedom issues facing the world, and facing Australia in particular, have only intensified. And I can't give you a full update of the position in Australia, but each year I give a bit of an update of some of the developments adverse to religious liberty that have occurred in Australia since the previous year. Since our last talk, several states and territories of Australia have passed legislation or indicated an intention to pass legislation to override religious confession privilege. Queensland has joined several other states and territories in requiring medical professionals with a conscientious objection to the voluntary termination of pregnancy to refer patients seeking that procedure to a medical professional who they know does not share their conscientious objection. Queensland and New South Wales have joined the growing list of Australian states and territories which criminalise a wide range of actions which occur near clinics where voluntary terminations of pregnancy occur, with no consideration of the religious motivations of those who seek to publicly pray in such places, or who seek to provide information about free medical care and other tangible forms of assistance available to vulnerable pregnant women. Since our last lecture, the Ruddock Review of Religious Freedom has taken place, as you all know. There's been another Senate inquiry which was miraculously performed within about a week, which delivered its report today as well. the Ruddock report is a more significant report because that's a report which took place over a long period of time and a long period of consultation, including consultations that took place here at Notre Dame in February this year. But whilst the Ruddock report has not been publicly released, as most of you will know, some of the recommendations have been initially selectively, mischievously and manipulatively leaked to the press. And the response to date to that leak, to those leaked recommendations cannot cause anyone to feel confident that the completely inadequate legislative framework for the protection of religious freedom in this country is going to improve, at least not anytime soon. One of the things we're very proud to do here at Notre Dame is to encourage our research students and academics to research and publish in important areas, particularly those where others are not quite so keen to publish and research, areas such as law and religion, religious freedom, religious confession privilege, and issues relating to the intrinsic value of every human life. As Father Miss Campbell observed in his book For Notre Dame, in a Catholic university, scholars must engage in research which analyses and critiques contemporary political, economic and social developments from a Catholic perspective. Such scholars must be unafraid to undertake thoughtful social criticism in an effort to forge a more just and moral order. Pope and now Saint John Paul II put it this way in his key writing on Catholic universities, which all the academics at Notre Dame here know and love, Ex Corde Ecclesia. He said, "If need be, a Catholic university must have the courage to speak uncomfortable truths which do not please public opinion, but which are necessary to safeguard the authentic good of society." If researching in such areas as this sounds like you, then our Associate Dean Research, Professor Keith Thompson, who strategically placed himself right at the back of the room, I'd like to hear from him. You might have noticed that I mentioned religious freedom as one of those uncomfortable truths, but that is certainly what it seems to be in Australia at the moment. There's a lot of confusion about what freedom of religion means, and today many in the West would like to restrict this freedom, if they permit it at all, to freedom to worship, but not to worship by praying the rosary if you're in the wrong place. In most states and territories in Australia, that could be a crime. So some even see publicly professing your faith to be a crime, or to be a concession, allowing that to be a major concession. Others seem at core to call for religious freedom, but they only really want freedom for their particular brand of religion, followers of their religious tradition. But for religious freedom to be a real freedom, it must extend to all those who seek not just to consult their conscience belief in religion from time to time, but who actively seek to act in accordance with the demands and dictates of their religious faith and their conscience, whether they be Christians, Muslims, Jews, or followers of one of the many other and increasingly other numbers of religious traditions in Australia. The Catholic Catechism recognises this. It describes religious freedom, and I quote, as a natural right of the human person to civil liberty. That is, immunity within just limits from external constraint in religious matters by political authorities. It argues that this natural right ought to be acknowledged in the juridical order of society in such a way that it constitutes a right. And as I've just been talking about, in Australia today, the natural right to religious freedom is not acknowledged in the juridical order of society in such a way that it constitutes a right. Quoting from the dogmatic constitution of the Church, Lumen Gentium, the Catholic Catechism also makes this observation about the Church's relationship to Muslims, followers of the religious tradition, the focus of this evening's very important talk. It says, "Place of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator, in the first place amongst whom are the Muslims. These profess to hold the faith of Abraham, and together with us, they adore the one merciful God, mankind's judge on the last day." So I consider tonight's talk on Islamophobia to be directly in line with the mission of the Catholic School of Law. And I'm very pleased that we're able to host a religious liberty lecture on this topic. Now, this scripture tells us that we need to be particularly kind to our visiting professor, who hails from the United States. But it also tells us a bit about how we should respond to others who come to Australia from other countries and from different religious traditions. But before I introduce our speaker, I just want to say a little bit about the place of Islam on our continent, because it's often portrayed as being something which is new or novel to our shores. But in fact, Muslim contact with Australia predates even European settlement. It began around the 1750s, as far as we can tell, with visits to northern Australia by Makassar fishermen from southern Sulawesi, in what is now part of Indonesia. These visits continued for over 150 years and included generally peaceful contact with Australia's Aboriginal peoples in those places. Although some Muslims came to Australia as sailors on British ships or as convicts, Muslims began to arrive in larger numbers as camel transportation began to be adopted from 1840. Known generically, but mostly wrongly, as Afghans, these camel drivers were mainly from Pushtun tribes of what is now Pakistan, and some also came from Afghanistan. The numbers peaked at around 3,000 and declined with the collapse of camel transportation in the 1920s, Federation, and the first act of the new Federated Parliament, which was the introduction of the White Australia policy. From the 1960s, Muslim immigrants again began to arrive in Australia from Turkey, Pakistan, and from Indonesia. They were joined by refugees and other migrants from Afghanistan and Lebanon from the 1970s and from Bosnia in the 1990s. So Islam is not new in this continent. Nor do followers of Islamic traditions in this country form a huge proportion of the population. In the latest census, about 2.6% of the population identified as Muslim. That's about 0.2% more than those who identify as Buddhist, and about 0.7% more than those who identify as Hindu. But growth in these religious traditions in Australia is completely and comprehensively dwarfed by the growth of no religion in Australia. It's growth in this category which is causing far greater change in this country and leading to those clashes with religious freedoms that I mentioned at the outset. And that category has risen from just 0.8% in 1966 to 30.1% in 2016. If it was a religious denomination, it would be the largest denomination in Australia. And it's been accompanied by the growing religious illiteracy of the West. As Christian Brugger has observed, in Australia there's an astonishing level of religious ignorance and oblivion. Religion is simply not in the daily categories of thinking. Now, part of this ignorance is the failure of the media and others to recognise the diverse cultural and religious backgrounds of Australian Muslims. This is critical because, as Abdullah Saeed has observed in Islam in Australia, in contemporary Muslim communities around the world, what is often understood as Islam is actually a hodgepodge of local cultural practice juxtaposed with some Islamic ideas. The attitudes of Australia's Muslim population may therefore vary widely, and they do vary widely, by reference to their geographic and cultural origins, the form of Islam that they follow, and the zeal with which they follow their faith. So when a terrorist incident perpetrated by a purported follower of one of the Islamic traditions occurs in this country, it's quite misleading and incorrect to equate that behaviour with Islam, or Muslims as a whole, as though they were a homogenous group. The number of complaints of religious discrimination to those Commonwealth, state and territory bodies with power to hear such complaints, which are few themselves, are said to be relatively small. Most of the time it's pointless complaining to those authorities because they don't actually have any legislative basis to do anything. That's certainly the Commonwealth position. However, it's the minority faiths and followers of the Islamic traditions in particular who appear to bear a disproportionate burden of vilification, discrimination, harassment, intimidation, verbal and physical abuse, property damage and vandalism and hate crimes on the grounds of their religious belief in Australia. For example, a study of Muslim New South Wales University students in 2013 to 2014 found that 44% had been insulted or called names because of their religion, 44%. More than a quarter had experienced discrimination in accessing health services, and the majority had experienced discrimination because of their religion in an educational setting. Studies have also found that discrimination against Muslims in Australia increased after the September 11 and attacks. And I've just come from an interfaith forum at Parliament House, where one of the presenters spoke about the fact that that happens every time there's an incident anywhere in the world that involves people who claim to be or are said to be by the media Muslim. Between September 2014 and December 2015, 243 Islamophobia incidents were reported to the Islamophobia Register in Australia. They range from verbal insults and threats to property damage to non-violent and violent attacks. They don't tend to make the nightly news, and they're likely to constitute only a very small fraction of what actually happens. What makes the nightly news? Terrorist attacks. So this evening I've got great pleasure, and you've been waiting for this moment since I started talking, I know, of introducing Professor Daniel Peterson. Professor Peterson is a Professor of Islamic Studies and Arabic in the Department of Asian and Near Eastern Languages at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. He's the founder and for many years served as Editor-in-Chief of BYU's Middle Eastern Text Initiative, which translates those texts into English to make them available to a wider audience. His publications include a biography entitled Muhammad, Prophet of God, and tonight he's going to address us on the subject of Islamophobia. So let's welcome him now.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here, and as I hear the description of the mission of Notre Dame University and of the law school, the commitment to religious liberty, I'm really doubly excited to be here because I believe very strongly in this. I think it's extraordinarily important, and I think it's extraordinarily important for there to be religious voices in the academic community, representing those viewpoints with articulateness and learning. I apologize in advance. I had a speech prepared. I've been adding to it, modifying it ever since I arrived. I have no idea how long it is. I apologize in advance. I suggest that you save your cell phone batteries for gaming, whatever you want to do, until the 4th or 5th hour of my remarks. I said the other day to a group that academics often go into the profession because they love to hear the sound of their own voices. We have opinions. We want everyone to hear them, whether they want to hear them or not. And my favorite definition of the word professor is a person who talks in other people's sleep. So you're welcome. Just try not to be obvious about it. Well, I'll proceed with my remarks here, which uncharacteristically I've written out because I have a lot that I want to get into this. Strife between the world of Islam and Christendom is many centuries old, precisely because they share geographical borders and common theological territory and dispute over those common areas. Both claim Abraham, Jesus, the legacy of the biblical prophets, and they've faced off against each other militarily and politically since the 7th century. As mentioned in Dean Quinlan's kind introduction, I launched a project at Brigham Young University back in the 1990s called the Islamic Translation Series, which ultimately grew into the broader Middle Eastern Texts Initiative. It was intended not only to fill a gaping hole in Western scholarship, but to build a badly needed bridge between the Islamic world and the West. In 2001, however, if I can do this, oh, there we are. 2001, however, as I watched the 9/11 attacks unfold on television, I wondered whether my little project had any value at all still. What was happening before our eyes was so big, so obviously a turning point in modern history, that my effort seemed pathetically irrelevant. And then, almost as clearly as if I'd actually heard a voice, the words came into my mind, "It's more important now than ever." I still regard the strengthening of mutual understanding between Muslims and the cultural heirs of the West, which it's a curious term, I take to include Australia here down under, as an urgent priority as well as a personal one. Earlier this month, my attention was drawn to a call for a Muslim immigration ban in Australia. That call came from a Dr. Augusto Zimmerman, who teaches law at Murdoch University in Perth, Western Australia. Since I'm politically and socially conservative, Dr. Zimmerman and I probably share some common views, but I'm grateful to him for volunteering to serve as a foil for my remarks tonight, because I think he's profoundly wrong on this issue. The immediate inspiration for Professor Zimmerman's call was the stabbing attack by a Somali Muslim man on Bourke Street in Melbourne earlier this month. I'm sure that everybody in this room is aware of this story and of the senseless murder of the Melbourneian cafe owner, Sisto Malaspina, who was apparently widely loved. The past 4 successful terrorist attacks on Australia's soul have all been carried out by Muslim terrorists, Professor Zimmerman wrote. Australia, he observed, has a population of approximately 24 million, and around 500,000 of its people are Muslims. Needless to say, most Muslims are not terrorists, but unfortunately, all terrorists consider themselves to be faithful Muslims. Terrorists are drawn exclusively from this specific religious group. Well, no. Now, I don't pretend that a serious problem of Islam-related terrorist violence doesn't exist, or deny that in recent years Muslims have loomed very large in terrorist attacks. I'm not a Pollyanna. Even since arriving here in Australia, I've read about not only the state funeral for Sisto Malaspina, but the arrest of 3 Muslim men suspected of plotting a mass casualty attack in Melbourne. I understand and am even sympathetic to the fears of Islamist immigrant terrorism revealed in surveys both here and in Australia and in my home country. But it's only true that terrorists are drawn exclusively from among Muslims if one has a very short time horizon and ignores non-Islam related terrorism. Let's look briefly, for example, at the history of terrorist attacks and mass murders in Australia. This won't be a very cheery list, but it's necessary to make my point. It was Croatian separatists who probably carried out the September 1972 Sydney Yugoslav General Trade and Tourist Agency bombing, the February 1978 Hilton Hotel bombing in Sydney, which resulted in the formation of the Australian Federal Police, has never really been solved, but there seems no connection with Islam or Muslims. Throughout the 1980s, the Australian Nationalist Movement, a West Australian neo-Nazi group, engaged in a series of bombings and other terrorist acts designed to intimidate the Asian population. The December 1982 bombings of the Israeli consulate and the Hakoah Club in Sydney very likely grew out of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but that doesn't necessarily mean, and the early 1980s probably didn't mean, that they were religiously motivated. Nominally Christian Armenian terrorists assassinated the Turkish consul general and his security attaché in Sydney in December 1980 and bombed the Turkish consulate in Melbourne in November 1986. Opposition to French nuclear testing motivated the June 1995 firebombing of the French consulate in West Perth, Western Australia. Martin Bryant, who killed 35 and left 23 wounded at Port Arthur, Tasmania in April 1996, had no discernible political or religious motivation for his actions. In July 2001, Peter James Knight launched a lethal attack against the East Melbourne Family Planning Clinic. He was a militant anti-abortionist. Internationally speaking, we shouldn't overlook such cases as that of Anders Breivik, a militant anti-Muslim who killed 77 Norwegians and injured 319 in bomb and shooting attacks in July 2011. In my own country, too, terrorists and mass murderers aren't always Muslims. In October 2017, for instance, a 64-year-old white man named Stephen Paddock opened fire on a crowd of more than 22,000 people at a country music festival in Las Vegas, killing nearly 60 and wounding 422. Another 429 were injured in the ensuing panic. In August 2017, a 20-year-old white Nazi sympathizer sped his car into a crowd of anti-racist protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia, killing a woman and injuring at least 19 others. In June 2017, a 66-year-old white supporter of the Democratic Socialist Senator Bernie Sanders shot at Republican members of Congress during an early morning baseball practice, severely wounding several people, including Representative Steve Scalise of Louisiana, the majority whip of the House of Representatives. In May 2017, a 35-year-old white man named Jeremy Joseph Christian began harassing Muslim teenagers on a train in Portland, Oregon, shouting, "We need Americans here." When 2 bystanders interceded, Christian stabbed and killed both of them. But even if non-Americans were the problem in the United States, why worry about only Muslim immigrants? For instance, in April 2007, an undergraduate student at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, a legal U.S. resident of South Korean origin, killed 32 people on campus and wounded another 17 with 2 semi-automatic pistols. It remains the deadliest school shooting in American history. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when anarchism was a very visible issue in the United States, most anarchist publications in the country, Freiheit and the Freie Arbeiterstimme, for instance, were in Yiddish, German, or Russian. The German immigrant, anarchist Johann Most, advocated the propaganda of the deed, for which he used the German term Attentat, which in modern Germans come to mean simply assassination. Accordingly, among other things, Freiheit published a bomb-making manual, the very kind of thing that today we popularly associate with Al-Qaeda. The existing system will be quickest and most radically overthrown, he wrote, by the annihilation of its exponents. Therefore, massacres of the enemies of the people must be set in motion. Should we have banned German immigration to the United States? On 6th of September 1901, a Polish-American anarchist assassinated President William McKinley in Buffalo, New York, which brought Theodore Roosevelt into the White House. Notoriously, too, in 1927, the Italian-born American anarchists Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in the electric chair for murdering a guard and a paymaster during an ideologically motivated 1920 Massachusetts armed robbery. Many of the most prominent figures of the golden age of American anarchism were Jewish. Would an earlier Professor Zimmerman have advocated a moratorium on Jewish immigration to the United States? If so, that would have been an enormous loss for my country. What an asset Jewish immigrants have been to American culture, science, business, and scholarship. Emma Lazarus, herself of Sephardic Jewish heritage, wrote the famous lines engraved on the base of the Statue of Liberty in New York's harbor. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Now that's not a door that, in my opinion, should be slammed casually shut. Writing the massive, solid, ancient Australian tectonic plate as you do, you are mercifully relatively free of seismic threats. Earthquakes and volcanoes tend to occur where tectonic plates collide, as with the famous Ring of Fire around the Pacific Ocean. Cultures resemble tectonic plates, and when they collide and clash, there's often strife. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many Americans saw Italian immigration as a threat. Italian immigrants to the United States were often poor, uneducated, and, horror of horrors, Catholic. A few were anarchists. Stereotypically, although it was seldom actually true, they were linked to the mafia. So Italian immigration was severely restricted and occasional lynchings occurred. One of the largest mass lynchings in American history killed 11 imprisoned Italians in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1891. Afterward, the police arrested hundreds of additional Italian immigrants on the grounds that they were all criminals. Teddy Roosevelt, 10 years before his presidency, notoriously remarked that the lynching was, quote, a rather good thing, end quote. John M. Parker, who helped to organize the lynch mob and who described Italians as, quote, just a little worse than the Negro, being, if anything, filthier, their habits lawless and treacherous, would go on 2 decades later to be elected Louisiana's governor. But are foreigners really the problem? 8 months into the presidential administration of Donald Trump in October 2017, the online magazine Vox ran an article accurately titled, "White American Men Are a Bigger Domestic Terrorist Threat Than Muslim Foreigners. Since Trump took office, more Americans have been killed by white American men with no connection to Islam than by Muslim terrorists or foreigners." In October of this year, Cesar Altieri Sayoc Jr., a very vocal 56-year-old Trump supporter, sent pipe bombs to many prominent Trump critics, including both Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, former Vice President Joe Biden, and the actor Robert De Niro. And let's not forget Timothy McVeigh, the American anti-government militant and professed agnostic, anything but a Muslim, who perpetrated the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people and injured more than 680 others. Prior to the September 11th attacks, his bombing was the deadliest act of terrorism in American history. Strikingly, 26 of the 27 deadliest mass shooters in American history had one thing in common, and it wasn't Islam. They weren't raised by their biological fathers. But let's return to Dr. Zimmerman's call for a ban on Muslim immigration to Australia. The problem, he continues, is that we simply do not know who to trust amongst a religious group that largely despises our democracy, culture, and laws, and that do not even accept the principle of religious tolerance and separation of powers. Now, the problem of not knowing who to trust is a perennial one, of course. We typically don't know, and we can't detain or arrest a person before the commission of a crime. Nobody else had the slightest idea that Stephen Paddock would open fire on that crowd of Las Vegas concert goers until he did, and we still have no idea why he did it. But is it really true, as Zimmerman claims, that Muslims largely despise Western democracy, culture, and laws? It is true, of course, that many, if not most, governments across the Arab and Islamic worlds are autocratic. But beyond at most a thin veneer, vanishingly few of these are theocratic. As has been obviously true in places like modern Egypt and Syria and Libya, where Colonel Gaddafi replaced King Idris, many of these governments have their roots in, and to some extent continue to be, military dictatorships. Elsewhere, as in Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Jordan, monarchies remain. This goes back historically until perhaps AD 945, when the Buwayhids conquered Baghdad and effectively put the Abbasid Caliph there under house arrest. The Caliphate had been an expressly religio-political office, with the Arabic term indicating the Caliph was the Khalifat Rasulullah, the vicarious representative or successor of the Messenger of God, Muhammad. But increasingly thereafter, rulers gained and held power by frank force of arms, with little or no specifically religious legitimation. The term Amir, or Emir, has come to function today rather like the English word prince. At its linguistic root, though, it betrays its historical military sense of commander. And nothing could be plainer than the word sultan, which is unambiguously derived from the Arabic noun sulta, or power. One is reminded of Mao's bluntly cynical dictum that political power flows from the barrel of a gun. A couple of years ago, I read a journalist's horrified report of the army's assumption of rule over Egypt in the person of General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. He seems to have missed General al-Sisi's replacement of Air Chief Marshal Hosni Mubarak, and Mubarak's replacement of Colonel Anwar Sadat, and Colonel Sadat's replacement of Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Colonel Nasser's replacement of General Naguib, who had deposed King Farouk in the 1952 Free Officers' Revolt. A long evolution was required to go from the rather self-seeking revolt of the barons that culminated in Magna Carta at Runnymede to the rights and representative democracy enshrined in such documents as the American and Australian constitutions. In my own constitutional republic, though, we didn't abolish slavery until 1865, didn't grant women the vote until 1920, and permitted legally enforced public segregation until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Similar blemishes, I know, can be located on Australia's legal historical record. We're all humans. Unfortunately, the Islamic world has yet to work its way through this process, which required many centuries for the English-speaking nations. But let me share some perhaps underappreciated aspects of the Islamic record, which, given that Muslims too are human, isn't all sweetness and light, but which offers some remarkable bright spots. There is, for example, the famously debated convivencia of Islamic Spain, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews managed to live relatively well together by the standards of the medieval West, in which Jews were scarcely tolerated and Muslims weren't tolerated at all. And there are the Christian prime ministers or wazirs of Egypt under the Fatimids and others. The story of the Caliph Omar's respect for the sanctity of Jerusalem's Holy Sepulchre, which I have a picture of there, immediately following the Muslim conquest of that city in 637 AD, deserves to be better known among both Christians and Muslims, as does the solicitous care that the great Salah ad-Din, or Saladin, took for the honor of the Holy Sepulchre when he reconquered Jerusalem from the Crusaders in AD 1187. But now in my own inadequate translations, I offer some verses from the Quran, the foundational sacred scripture of the Islamic faith, believed by Muslims to be the literal word of God. Consider, for instance, this passage, which, addressed to the Prophet Muhammad, seems palpably weary of interreligious disputes. You have your religion, and I have my religion. Let there be no coercion in religion, says one important passage, using an Arabic grammatical form that expresses absolute negation. Call to the way of God with wisdom and beautiful preaching, and dispute with them in the best way. And do not dispute with the people of the Scripture except in the best way, except with those among them who commit injustice. And say, we believe in what has been revealed to us, and in what has been revealed to you. Our God and your God is one, and we submit to him. Religious differences, the Quran plainly suggests, are actually a deliberate part of God's plan. We made you peoples and tribes that you might come to know one another. Every individual has a direction to which he turns, so compete with one another in good works. Wherever you are, God will bring you all together. Truly, God has power over everything. To each of you, we have prescribed a law and a way of life. Had God willed it, he could have made you all one people, but that he might test you by means of what he has given you. So compete with one another in good works. All of you will return to God. So he will inform you regarding the matters about which you used to disagree. The Quran even indicates specific respect for Christianity, as in, among numerous others, this passage, which many commentators believe alludes to the lamps burning in Syrian Christian monasteries and churches. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. A similitude of his light is as a niche, within which is a lamp. The lamp is as if it were a brilliant star, lit from a blessed olive tree, neither eastern nor western, whose oil would almost glow forth, though no fire touched it. Light upon light. God guides to his light whomever he will. And God strikes similitudes for the people, and God knows all things. This light is found in houses that God has permitted to be raised, and that his name be remembered in them. In them there praise him morning and evening, men whom neither commerce nor sale distracts from remembering God, and establishing prayer and giving alms. They fear a day on which hearts and eyes will be overturned, that God may reward them for the best of their deeds, and even increase his reward for them from his bounty, for God gives without reckoning to whomever he wishes. I believe that, contrary to Professor Zimmerman, a solid Quranic case can be made for accepting the principle of religious tolerance. And is Zimmerman justified in alleging that Muslims constitute a religious group that largely despises our democracy, culture, and laws? In 2007, John Esposito and Dalia Mogahed published an important book entitled Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think, based upon an enormous global Gallup survey that, among other things, conducted tens of thousands of interviews with Muslims in more than 35 nations. Their book replaces often biased suppositions with quantifiable facts, and those facts are fascinating. Among them, 32% of Americans say that they see nothing to admire about Muslims. By contrast, the percentage of Muslims who say that they admire nothing about the West is only 10% in Saudi Arabia, 6.3% in Jordan, and 1% in Egypt. Muslims around the world say that what they most admire about the West is its technology and its democracy, the same two top responses given by Americans when asked the same question. The majority of those surveyed want religious leaders to have no direct role in crafting a constitution. When asked what they admire about the West, the politically radicalized and moderates mentioned these top three spontaneous responses. 1, technology. 2, the West's value system, hard work, self-responsibility, rule of law, cooperation. And 3, fair political systems, democracy, respect of human rights, freedom of speech, gender equality. Contrary to popular belief that extremists are anti-democracy, a significantly higher percentage of the politically radicalized, 50% versus 35% of moderates, say that moving toward greater governmental democracy will foster progress in the Arab and Muslim world. There is no significant difference in the level of personal piety between the majority who condemn terrorism and the fringe minority who condone it. Those who condone terrorism admire Western freedom and liberty as much as the moderate majority. The Gallup researchers asked residents of predominantly Muslim countries about the moral justifiability of attacks on civilians, and they posed the same question to a representative sample of Americans. What did they find? Levels of support for this common definition of terrorism were no higher in Muslim lands than they were among the general American population, and with few exceptions did not exceed percentages in the single digits. As the Quran itself says at Surah 5, verse 32, whoever kills a person, unless it be for homicide or for corruption in the earth, it is as if he killed all of humankind. A recent study shows that only 46% of Americans think that bombing and other attacks intentionally aimed at civilians are never justified, while 24% believe these attacks are often or sometimes justified. Contrast this with data taken the same year for some of the largest majority Muslim nations, in which 74% of respondents in Indonesia agree that terrorist acts are never justified. In Pakistan, that figure is 86%, in Bangladesh, 81%, and in Iran, 80%. Similarly, 6% of the American public thinks that attacks in which civilians are targets are completely justified. As points of comparison, in both Lebanon and Iran, this figure is 2%, and in Saudi Arabia, it is 4%. In Europe, Muslims in Paris and London are no more likely than their counterparts in the general public to believe attacks on civilians are justified, and are as likely to reject violence, even for a, quote, noble cause, end quote. In Indonesia, those who say that 9/11 was unjustified support this response by citing religious principles. It is against God's law, God hates murder, or it is against Islam, as well as humanitarian ones. The loss of life was tragic, and so forth. while those who say that 9/11 was justified cite political grievances to support their response, not religious justifications. Those who condone acts of terrorism are no more likely to be religious than the rest of the population. Is religious fanaticism a key driver behind extremist political views among Muslims? No, evidently not. Indeed, most of those who rioted and torched the suburbs of Paris in 2005 were not mosque goers. Moreover, as many of you are probably aware, many of the 9/11 hijackers behaved in strikingly un-Islamic ways just prior to the attacks, drinking heavily and patronizing porn shops and strip clubs. In 2005, Robert Pape of the University of Chicago published a vitally important book entitled Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism. Based upon meticulous analysis of every suicide attack occurring anywhere in the world between 1980, when modern suicide terrorism began, and 2003, Pape's case is factually rich and rigorously argued. The data show, he concludes, that there is little connection between suicide terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism, or any one of the world's religions. In fact, the leading instigators of suicide attacks are the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, a Marxist-Leninist group whose members are from Hindu families, but who are adamantly opposed to religion. Rather, he continues, what nearly all suicide terrorist attacks have in common is a specific secular and strategic goal: to compel modern democracies to withdraw military forces from territory that the terrorists consider to be their homeland. Religion is rarely the root cause, although it is often used as a tool by terrorist organizations in recruiting and in other efforts to serve in service of the broader strategic objective. Even in the Middle East, at least half of the suicide attacks between 1980 and 2003 had little, if any, link to Islamic fundamentalism. Indeed, many such attacks were undertaken by communists, secular nationalists, and even Christians. The motivations were this worldly, tied to national liberation. Why have we so misunderstood what's going on? For one thing, we've paid disproportionate attention, in a sense, to suicide attacks in the Middle East. After all, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka target that nation's Sinhalese Buddhist majority, not us. The West has had no vital interest there and little representation, and in America at least, we seldom hear reports about Sri Lanka on the national or nightly news, so our sample is skewed. Moreover, although they've spoken openly, we've paid curiously little attention to what suicide attackers have actually said about their motives and goals. The fundamental point of Professor Pape's argument is strikingly congruent with the entirely distinct case made by Graham Fuller in his brilliant 2010 book, A World Without Islam. Via sweeping analyses of world history, Fuller, a political analyst specializing in Islamic extremism who formerly served as CIA station chief in Kabul, Afghanistan, and as vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council, argues that religion is the vehicle of religious confrontation and turmoil, not the cause. If there had never been an Islam, he writes, if a Prophet Muhammad had never emerged from the deserts of Arabia, if there had been no saga of the spread of Islam across vast parts of the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, wouldn't the relationship between the West and the Middle East today be entirely different? No. I argue it might actually be quite similar to what we see today. Most of the history of the West's relations with the Middle East is really about the geopolitics of empires and states, and not much about religion itself, regardless of the slogans, banners, and ideological fervor invoked at the popular level to support the state. Take Islam out of the equation, there's a very good chance you'd still find the Middle East at loggerheads with the West. Fuller compares the situation to a furious argument between spouses over whether the pasta is overcooked. Their anger may be entirely real, but plainly there's much more going on than mere disagreement over rigatoni. So too, in the Middle East, communities, states, politics, power, and regional nationalisms are all at issue. Religion serves as a handy tag, constitutes an important element of identity in which the specific theology is really only incidental, he writes. As in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, so in the Islamic world, the problems stemming from colonialism and imperialism would exist in equal measure without Islam. Islam, Fuller admits, seems to offer an instant and uncomplicated analytical touchstone for most affairs in the Middle East, by which to make sense of today's convulsive world. By referring to Islam, we can reduce things to a polarized struggle between Western values and the Muslim world. But that oversimplification, what the Swiss Muslim intellectual Tariq Ramadan has described as Islamizing the problem, is false and misleading. In other words, what we typically understand to be a fundamentally religious conflict in the Middle East may at its root have relatively little to do with religion. It isn't what we don't know that gives us trouble, the American humorist Will Rogers once quipped. It's what we know that ain't so. Fuller is acutely aware of the prominent place that Islam occupies in current disputes worldwide, but he contends that the faith has primarily served as a flag or banner for other deeper kinds of rivalries and confrontations taking place. The factor of Islam provides focus, color, and vigor, but is not especially central. Tracing rivalries between East and West back to the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, he maintains that Islam is merely the most recent vehicle for expressing resistance to the West, the latest banner in which the old but ongoing geopolitical struggles of the Middle East are perpetuated. Surveying ostensibly religious disputes going back centuries before the rise of Islam, Fuller contends that religious doctrine is almost never the issue at stake. We shouldn't be surprised, of course, to see the powerful symbols and inducements offered by religion used to mark ethnic fault lines and to sanctify conflicts. Think again of the collision of tectonic plates. But we shouldn't be misled by superficial appearances. If Islam hadn't come along, Fuller plausibly argues, Eastern Orthodox Christianity would have played much the same role. The Middle East, he says, was quite capable, without Islam, of developing a version to the West. In summary, he says the present crisis of East-West relations, or between the West and Islam, has really very little to do with religion and everything to do with political and cultural frictions, interests, rivalries, and clashes. But let's take a question that can be far more local than international and diplomatic. Honor killings are commonly regarded as the product of Islamic religious fanaticism. But according to Esposito and Mugahed, research indicates that 69.4% of the men who committed honor killings in Jordan did not perform their daily prayers, and 55.5% of them did not fast. That these men failed to observe the most obligatory rituals of Islam suggests that their act of murder is not motivated by religious zeal or devotion. Rather, other factors normally associated with criminal behavior are more likely to play a role. For example, most of these men had a record of violent behavior. 35.1% had already served sentences for previous crimes. Furthermore, 32.4% were illiterate. Only 3.7% had attended college, and 24.1% were brought up in broken homes. Can't help but thinking of those fatherless American mass murderers already mentioned above. Islamizing the problem is problematic for many reasons. For one thing, accurate understanding is essential to dealing with any challenge. For another, misconceiving the issues could make the situation much, much worse. As Esposito and Mugahed observe, diagnosing terrorism as a symptom and Islam as the problem, though popular in some circles, is flawed and has serious risks with dangerous repercussions. It confirms radical beliefs and fears, alienates the moderate Muslim majority, and reinforces a belief that the war against global terrorism is really a war against Islam. Whether one is radical or moderate, this negative attitude is a widespread perception. Now, radical Islamic terrorism against innocent civilians in the West has, in my view, at least two major aims, beyond sheer nihilism and thuggery. The first is to undermine the West's sense of security and thus to create panic. The purpose of terrorism, Vladimir Lenin is reported to have said, is to terrorize. Terrorists succeed when their target population succumbs to fear and is dominated by it. The second goal is to provoke mistrust and persecution of mainstream Muslims, to incite a crackdown on them and thus to radicalize many of them. However, an even more essential reason in my mind to be cautious about Islamizing the problem of terrorism is the potential damage such thinking might do to our hard-won Western heritage of religious liberty. I'm not naive about this. Justice Robert Jackson of the United States Supreme Court, writing a dissenting opinion in the 1949 case Terminiello versus City of Chicago, famously argued against what he saw as the danger of converting the American Constitution's Bill of Rights into a suicide pact. And I've long reflected on the case of Alexander Kerensky, the democratic socialist, who it's often forgotten was the leader of Russia, not the Tsar, who was actually overthrown by the Bolsheviks. As I understand it, although Kerensky was warned about the danger that Vladimir Lenin's return to Russia posed to democracy, he felt as a Democrat that he should not prevent that return. And so, as Winston Churchill put it in The World Crisis, the Germans, quote, turned upon Russia the most grisly of weapons. They transported Lenin in a sealed truck like a plague bacillus from Switzerland to Russia, end quote. And in the sequel, scores of millions were murdered by the Soviet state. Had Adolf Hitler been shut down even undemocratically, how many lives might have been saved from the hands of the Third Reich and the horrors of the Second World War? These are serious questions. And it's a virtual certainty that more people worldwide, and yes, more Australians, will die at the hands of Islamist terrorists. But these issues emphatically need perspective. We're always calculating risks and benefits and lesser risks against greater ones, and we commonly misjudge them. Many people are terrified of flying. Few are scared of driving. Yet according to the National Safety Council in the United States, an American's odds of dying in a motor vehicle crash are 1 in 112, while the odds of her dying in a plane crash are 1 in 96,566. From what I can see, and perhaps I'm wrong, approximately 6 Australians have died at the hands of Muslim terrorists since the beginning of this century. I readily grant that a successful major terrorist attack could change those figures dramatically in the style of a 9/11. Still, thus far, that comes out to roughly 1 every 3 years. By contrast, about 1,300 Australians die annually in traffic accidents. But compare the odds, according to the National Safety Council, of an American's being electrocuted. 1 in 12,200. 1 in 704 will die while walking down the street. Sadly, 1 in 358 will die from an assault with a gun. 1 American in 234 will succumb to an overdose of a prescription painkiller. 1 in 144 will die from a fall. The most effective way, declares Augusto Zimmermann, to protect the basic rights of our people and reduce the risk of further terrorist attack is by tightening Australia's immigration policy, which involves reducing, even to the point of virtually halting, any further inflow of Muslim migrants to this country. Well, I suppose that the most effective way to eliminate termites in a house would be to drop a hydrogen bomb on it. And the most effective way to eliminate crime would be to eliminate people. We could end almost all traffic fatalities by banning motorized vehicles and closing our roads. In the 15th century, Prince Vlad III Tepes of Romania ranked among the most fierce defenders of Europe against the Muslim Ottoman Empire. But his defense came at a high cost. He's also known as Vlad the Impaler and as Vlad Dracula. His well-earned reputation for cruelty inspired the title of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel about an undead, blood-craving vampire. A defense can be too extreme. Being neither attorney nor Australian, I'm unfamiliar with your laws on the subject, but interfering with religious belief and practice in the United States is deadly serious, posing grave dangers to our Constitution's First Amendment, and thus threatening the very nature of our free society. That is why, mindful of popular and often government-sanctioned mistreatment of my own religious community and of federal government interference with the immigration of foreign converts to Mormonism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, along with 20 other scholars of Latter-day Saint and Mormon history, I signed a 2017 amicus brief that went to the Supreme Court of the United States in connection with President Donald J. Trump's so-called Muslim travel ban. One increasingly fashionable way of getting around the obvious clash between belief in religious liberty and a desire to suppress or limit Islam is, more or less flatly, to deny that Islam is a religion at all, to pronounce it a political ideology and thus a rather conventional political threat. In 2014, a state legislator in Oklahoma declared that Islam is not even a religion. It is a political system that uses a deity to advance its agenda of global conquest. In 2015, a former assistant United States attorney argued that Islam should be understood as conveying a belief system that is not merely or even primarily religious. In 2016, Michael Flynn, who briefly served as Donald Trump's national security advisor the following year, remarked in a public speech that, quote, Islam is a political ideology that hides behind the notion of it being a religion, end quote. In January 2018, a South Dakota state senator questioned whether the First Amendment guarantee of religious freedom even applies to Muslims. Now, such redefinition has been used before. It's one of the reasons that the United States required almost 2 centuries to elect its first, and thus far only, Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, who even in 1960 had to reassure the American public that he would not be directed in policy issues by the Vatican. My own church, too, is commonly depicted by its critics as a corporation and a political ideology masquerading as a faith, and thus perhaps undeserving of full constitutional protection. This is the familiar terrain of religious bigotry, and we should be extremely wary of entering it. Our own self-interest, not least as religious minorities, and collectively as a religious minority within a society that is increasingly and even aggressively secular, is intimately connected with how we treat others. A famous quotation from the anti-Nazi German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller comes readily to mind. In Germany, they came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics. I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came from me. By that time, no one was left to speak up. I'm reminded of a great passage from Robert Bolt's great play, A Man for All Seasons, centered on Sir Thomas More, a familiar name here, I think, who will eventually be executed by order of the mercurial, amoral, and lawless Henry VIII. Arrest him. Why? What has he done? He's bad. There's no law against that. There is, God's law. Then God can arrest him. Well, you talk, he's gone. And go he should, if he was the devil himself, until he broke the law. So now you'd give the devil benefit of law? Yes. What would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get after the devil? I'd cut down every law in England to do that. Oh, and when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide, Rover? The laws all being flat. This country's planted thick with laws from coast to coast. Man's laws, not God's. And if you cut them down and you're just the man to do it, do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would blow then? Yes, I'd give the devil benefit of law for my own safety's sake. Religious freedom is at best an endangered right in many countries worldwide, even in my own country. Support for religious liberty has been severely eroded over the past 25 years, since November 1993, when President Bill Clinton signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which Congress had passed almost unanimously. Now a sizable group of his own Democratic Party have set about to effectively repeal that piece of legislation. Religious liberty needs passionate, intelligent defense, not neglect, let alone active opposition. And we must face the challenge together. If I may, here at this Catholic university in a country under the English crown, I'll quote a Protestant reformer and an American revolutionary. The kingdom of God, said Martin Luther, is like a besieged city, surrounded on all sides by death. Each man has his place on the wall to defend, and no one can stand where another stands. But nothing prevents us from calling encouragement to one another. We must all hang together, remarked Benjamin Franklin to his fellow signers of the Declaration of Independence, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. I'm arguing not merely for mutual tolerance, where we permit each other to exist, but hold our noses while doing so, but for mutual appreciation and mutual encouragement. In his immortal Divine Comedy, the great early 14th century Italian poet Dante placed Muhammad solidly in hell. Plainly, as a medieval Christian, he was no particular friend of Islam. But unlike some of today's anti-Islamic polemicists, he could recognize good among Muslims. Thus, although he was theologically unable to do more for them because they lacked baptism, he placed the Islamic philosophers Avicenna and Averroes in the highest circle of hell, along with Plato and Aristotle and his guide and hero, the Roman poet Virgil. There, their only suffering is their unfulfillable yearning for heaven. Astonishingly, though, Dante also placed the brilliant Sultan and General Saladin among them. So highly did he and many other medieval Christians esteem the man who in 1187 had defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin and recaptured Jerusalem. I don't teach about Islam as if it was some dried insect specimen pinned to a museum wall. Rather, it offers me and my students a chance to revel in the insights and inspiring stories of a different but related worldview. When people occasionally call me wondering if they should be concerned about a new mosque being built in their neighborhood, I respond by saying that yes, they should be concerned. They should worry that they might miss its open house with its excellent and exotic food and its opportunity to make new friends. Some years ago, don't worry, I'm almost done. Some years ago, one of the largest Buddhist temples in the Western Hemisphere was built just a short drive from where my parents lived in Southern California. There was fear and concern in the community, but I was delighted. What a rich and wonderful cultural experience it has provided. Permit me a story from the relatively recent history of my own church that's plainly open to application far beyond my community. In the early 1980s, the leaders of my church announced the building of a temple, a sanctuary much more important to us and more sacred than our ordinary meeting houses, in a town just outside Stockholm, Sweden. As commonly happens after such announcements, fierce opposition arose, becoming so intense that Christer Stendahl, the Lutheran Bishop of Stockholm, felt the need to speak out publicly on the controversy. When he chose an ordinary Latter-day Saint meeting house near the projected temple construction site as the location for his press conference, that probably tipped his hand. But his position was easily predictable from his past. An eminent New Testament scholar and the former dean of Harvard Divinity School, Bishop Stendahl had a number of close Mormon friends and had spoken at the church's flagship school, Brigham Young University, several times. "Let the Mormons build their temple," he said simply. "Leave them alone." With that, he disposed of the elephant in the room. What he had to say thereafter, though, interests me much more. He laid down 3 rules for dealing with religions or worldviews that differ from one's own, rules that, to my mind, far transcend mere tolerance. First, he said, if you want to learn about a faith or a worldview, go first to those who love it, cherish it, find it meaningful. You'll have plenty of time, if you want, to consult its critics. Second, don't compare your best with the other's worst. Compare apples to apples, not to oranges. It's not fair, my example, to say, you have Osama bin Laden, while we have Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Every major group has its saints. Every major group, alas, has its villains. Compare them. Third, and to me most importantly, he counseled his audience to never forget holy envy. What did he mean by that phrase? He meant to look for things in the other faith or worldview from which we could learn. Not necessarily to convert, but to incorporate into our own lives. In connection with the proposed Stockholm Temple, Krista Stendahl specifically cited Latter-day Saint care for their ancestors and others of former generations, as illustrated by such practices as family history research and vicarious baptisms for the dead. I myself can illustrate his idea with the inspiration that I've felt in contemplating the simple discipleship of Mennonites, the reverence of Orthodox Jews for the Sabbath, and the sacrificial commitment of several of the priests I've known, including perhaps most notably Father George Anawati, a famous scholar of Islamic philosophy and theology and a Dominican monk, with whom I studied one-on-one in Cairo, and whom, like others who knew him, I came to love. Do you remember those Quranic passages that I cited earlier in my remarks? I cite them quickly again to remind you. We made you peoples and tribes that you might come to know one another. Compete with one another in good works. Wherever you are, God will bring you all together. Had God willed it, he could have made you all one people, but that he might test you by means of what he has given you. So compete with one another in good works. All of you will return to God, so he will inform you regarding the matters about which you used to disagree. I close with a thought from Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's 1779 play Nathan der Weise, Nathan the Wise, in which the great Saladin asks how to know which religion is true. The wise Jew, Nathan, answers with the famous ring parable. A magical ring has been passed over many generations from a father to his most loved son, which has the power to make its bearer beloved of God and of humankind. Finally, it arrives to a father with 3 sons who loves each of them equally. In the end, he makes 2 replicas, indistinguishable from the original, and privately gives each son a ring on his deathbed. But the brothers soon discover that each one has a ring, and they quarrel over which is authentic. When they go to court, the judge tells them that he cannot decide, and cannot even rule out the idea that the real ring has been lost and that all 3 are replicas. So he advises them that in order to find out which, if any, of the rings is genuine, they should try to live in a way that is pleasing to God and humanity, rather than relying on the miraculous or even magical powers of the ring to accomplish that. Or, as the Quran says, compete with one another in good works. Wherever you are, God will bring you all together. That seems to be an awfully good recipe for interfaith relationships and living in a multicultural society. Thank you very much.
Before I say anything in conclusion, Dan is willing to take questions if anyone would like to ask some questions. I'll moderate. Michael?
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
You very generously admitted one of the key attributes of Professor Augusto Zimmermann, who is your foil, which is that he's an adjunct professor of our law school.
Oh, is he?
And a very decent person.
I imagine he is.
So he's wrong on this.
He's wrong with this.
I'm going to use another foil to ask you this question, and that's our own Dr. Ian Benson, who asked me to ask you this question. He couldn't be here today, and Keith may have given you an inkling that he might. He's concerned about the use of words which end with phobia, because they can be attached to all sorts of things,
right.
And then anything which you might say which might not actually be phobic then gets characterised in that way. So he wanted me to ask you to say something about Islamophobia and whether that's a term which actually has meaning or is valuable.
It's not a word that I typically use, actually. And I'm really, really unhappy with the use of it in phrases like homophobia, because I don't think that there is literally, well, at least in most cases, not a fear of homosexuality or of gays or anything like that. In the case of Islamophobia, it seems to me to be possibly somewhat more accurate, because a lot of the concerns about Islam really are driven by fear. And I want to stress that I understand the fear. There really is a sense that we're under siege by a certain group who would, if they could, do us much more damage than they've been able to. If they could get the right bombs, they'd use them on a city like Sydney or New York, and would be happy to do it. So there is reason to be fearful, and a lot of the objections to Muslim immigration, a lot of concerns about Muhammad and so on, are driven genuinely by fear. So Islamophobia seems to me a little less inappropriate in this case than the phobia terms are in some other cases. But as I say, I don't typically use it myself. But it was used in the description, so I threw it in the title.
I use it myself.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, I think we should not discriminate any of the Muslims, and they are very good people. We work with them. There are few we know who have sort of indulged in terrorist activities. We can't deny that. What do you think is the source or the cause of this kind of behavior? Is it coming from Prophet's warrior-like experience, or is it coming from Quran itself and Hadith, where you find sort of dichotomous messages coming, like infidels and kill the warriors and all that kind of thing? Or is it coming from the loss of Ottoman Empire, or is it coming from materialism of the West, or whatnot?
It's coming from all of those things in a way. It's a complex thing. It doesn't have a single origin or root cause. I would say, and I quoted statistics to this point, that there is very little evidence that the people committing terrorist acts are unusually devout, or even as devout as maybe other Muslims are. So it's not clear to me that religion is a principal driver of Islamist terrorism. Now, can it be used to justify it? Yes, it can. And there are passages in the Quran. You can go to any anti-Muslim website, and they'll give you a generous list of the same quotations, the same passages. And the interesting thing is that the extremists and the anti-Islamic polemicists use the same list of texts. They view them the same way. It's the people in the middle who don't. So you do have passages that talk about laying in wait for the unbelievers, ambushing them, that sort of thing. My argument would be on that, and this, I actually thought of going this direction and then didn't. It would have been a very different talk, but would be a good second talk somewhere. To look very carefully at those passages, because I argue that the context is all important. That when you see a passage that says lay in wait for the infidels, it's not talking about a timeless rule for dealing with non-Muslims everywhere and at all times. It's talking in a specific context where there's a war already going on between the Islamic Ummah or community and the infidels, the unbelievers at Mecca, who had driven them out, stolen their property, and made war against them. Now, in the context of an ongoing war, the command to ambush your enemy and so on makes sense. To coin an example, my wife's heard it before, but I've said to people who've raised this question with me, consider Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II. Suppose that you find a letter from Dwight Eisenhower that says, bomb Berlin, Munich, and Frankfurt, and ambush the Germans wherever you see them. Well, it would make a great deal of sense if that's a letter from Dwight Eisenhower, the general, in 1944. But if it came from President Dwight Eisenhower in 1954, when Germany and the U.S. are at peace, you'd say, the man is a homicidal lunatic. I mean, what's going on here? Well, the fact that these verses all happened during an ongoing war, to me, makes all the difference in the world. It's not talking about you treat the unbelievers this way always. It's that in this particular war, with these particular unbelievers, that's what you should be doing. This is a war. This is a legitimate military strategy. But there are other factors. You talk about the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. I would say that one thing that you see happening here is Islam is a religion that believes itself to be the final revelation. The Prophet Muhammad is the Khatam al-Nabiyyin, the seal of the prophets. And Islam is supposed to go from triumph, to expand and fill the earth, and so on and so forth. And for a long time, actually, it made good progress in that direction. The early Islamic Arab conquests, but beyond that, I mean, the expansion into Indonesia and Southeast Asia and so on and so forth, and across North Africa, into Spain. This was pretty impressive, and they were the most advanced society on the planet in terms of science, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and so on. It took them a long time to realize that that had stopped, that probably by 1500, certainly by 1800, the West had pulled ahead. But the Middle East wasn't paying attention. There's a lesson in this for all of us, I think, that you can become so complacent. You know, you think you're on top of the world, and then all of a sudden you realize you're not. And so it provoked a crisis within the consciousness of thoughtful people in the Middle East, thoughtful Muslims. What happened to us? How can we fix this? And they've tried various ways, but one of the ways of fixing it is to go back to their roots, to go back to Islam. That doesn't always entail violence, but it does entail a more serious reconsideration of what made your culture great in the first place, which was Islam, the Quran, the impetus that gave the Arabs and then the Muslims to expand and grow and develop. So I think that Islamic extremism is a response to perceived exploitation by the West, colonialism, inferiority. A lot of things are happening there. And I'll be honest, the West has not always treated the Middle East well. I don't know how else we could have done it in the great global conflict with the communists. The US, for example, I won't say it was cynical. They were doing the best they could under certain circumstances, but you'd make allies with all sorts of people, including some really obnoxious ones. So people in the Middle East today say, you claim to believe in democracy, but you supported the Shah. You supported this dictatorial regime in our country. You're hypocrites. We don't trust you at all. And look what you did to us. You've exploited us for years. And there is truth in that. So there are a lot of reasons, but what I do want to argue against is the idea that Islamist terrorism is predominantly driven by the religion. I don't think it is. And I know, I tried to avoid accepting some quotations here, using the term moderate Islam or moderate Muslims, because many Muslims who are faithful Muslims object to that. They say, well, what does that mean? That if we're only moderately committed to our religion, we won't be violent, but if we take it really seriously, we will be? That's what the extremists say. If you're a good Muslim, you must be a Muslim extremist like me. And so I use the term mainstream Muslim. I haven't found a good term for it yet, but I want to argue that you can be a very devout Muslim, and I know scores of them well. Very devout, very serious, who are not even remotely inclined to violence and are appalled by the violence that they see being done in the name of their faith. So, yeah.
You touched on the subject I was going to actually ask about, because we view the peaceful verses, or some people call the Meccan verses, but there are the Medina verses, Surah 9, Ayah 29, the command to fight the Christian Jews, and Surah 98, for me, is not a violent one, but how do you reckon, considering there's abrogation in the Quran, there's a verse that says if a better verse comes along, surely Allah would know, and for example, Surah 98, Ayah 6, Christians and Jews and polytheists, so it's including everyone, you're damned to eternal hell, you are the worst of all creatures. So that's putting us lower than animals. I know the translation is right, because I listened to it.
You know, the fact is, I would say that, now I'm speaking as a non-Muslim here, that I don't think the Quran is thoroughly consistent on these things. There are later verses also that are very sympathetic to the Christians. And there are a lot of expectations in the Quran that followers, people of the book, will be saved after death and so on. But then I think you get into a war situation where the rhetoric heats up a bit. And there's no question that you have some difficult interpretive things. As I say, I could have devoted a lecture to that, or maybe 5, to deal with those interpretive thickets that occur there in the Quran. But overwhelmingly, I think you can make the case from the Quran. And not just from the Quran, but from the behavior of early Muslims. And the ones who were the so-called companions of the Prophet, who, if anyone understood his teaching, they did. Who went out of their way to be just toward Christians. I'll tell you the story of Omar. For example, I alluded to it here. Omar is the second caliph, very close student of the Prophet Muhammad. When the Muslims conquered Jerusalem, Omar goes into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and is given a tour around the church by the Patriarch Sophronius. And at a certain time, the call to prayer rings out. And the Patriarch understands by this point what that means. And he offers Omar a chance to to pray there in the church, and Omar refuses, will not pray in the church. And you think, well, why not? Is the church defiling in some way? No, that's not it at all. It's quite the opposite. He says to Sophronius, I will not pray here, because if I were to pray here, my troops would see it, and they would feel that they had the right to pray in this building too, and you would soon lose control of the building. So I will not pray here. I'll take my prayer rug outside, and I'll pray across the way. Now, if you go to Jerusalem today, if you go to the Holy Sepulchre, stand at the entrance, there behind you, there's a little nondescript mosque. I mean, nobody notices it. You'd never pick it out. It's just kind of lost in the buildings. Called the Mosque of Omar. That marks the traditional place where Omar prayed. But out of respect for the sanctity of that building, out of respect for the Christians, he would not set any precedent for his troops to go in and pray there. Now that, it seems to me, speaks really eloquently of how he understood Islam. Now he's also one of the great conquerors of early Islam. It's not as if he were some sort of primitive Quaker or something like that. He was willing to go out and fight, but he treated the Christians with respect there and elsewhere. Quite often, one of the first things he did in conquering a city, as in the early Muslim conquests, was to set aside a place for a mosque, but also to guarantee the places of worship for the Christians. So, and these are people who knew Muhammad well, knew what he was teaching, and that may sound vague, but that's really important in Islamic law, because these are the people who pass on the hadith, the traditions of what the Prophet taught. These are the authoritative interpreters of what Muhammad taught. And you look at their example and how they, on the whole, treated Christians. It's quite positive. So.
One more question on the right. That's you.
What you mentioned about, so if the extremism that we're seeing isn't linked to religion, what should, I suppose, moderate, faithful Muslims, what should their approach be? Should they take, often there's calls for Islamic leaders to condemn the violence, to meet, like we saw, meet with the Prime Minister, talk about what to do. And some of them found that very difficult because they said, we're not taking responsibility for this. And understandably, I can see why they wouldn't want to be saying, this is our religion that's doing this. But on the other hand, if they wash their hands of it completely, obviously there needs to be some kind of engagement with it. And what do you see, particularly I guess in the US, is there some kind of dialogue among the Muslim community as to how to engage with this?
It's a difficult issue for them to deal with. I've had long conversations with Muslim friends about this, and I've often said to them, look, you need to be speaking out more, and then they'll point out, and not without justice, we have been speaking out. It's just that it isn't carried in the news media. I remember meeting with the imam of a mosque in southern Arizona several years ago, and he was telling me about an experience where he had convened a whole conference against terrorism and extremism. They sent out notices to all the newspapers and all the news media and so on. He said, do you know how many of them came? Nobody, not one soul. There was no coverage at all. And then the next week, people were demanding to know, why didn't he ever do anything against extremism? Well, he said, I have been, but I never get any coverage for it. No one knows that it happens. Some that I've talked to have said, well, we're tired of being asked to comment on these things. These people are not connected with us. And the act of commenting, responding as if they are connected with us, cements in the popular mind that we're somehow responsible for them, which we're not. I noticed with regard to the Brook Street, and not the three that were just arrested in Melbourne, I think the account said that they had stopped attending the mainstream mosque there. They had set up a little private mosque of their own. In other words, the mainstream imam and so on had lost contact with them, didn't even know where they were, what they were doing. They tend to drop out of the mainstream and do their own thing. So the question is, what exactly should you do? Well, now, some people have asked me, well, why doesn't the Islamic community excommunicate them or do something to drive them out? The trouble is, there is no communion from which to excommunicate them. If you say you're a Muslim, you profess the Shahada, the testimony, you are. And the local imam doesn't have authority over you. He can't expel you from an organized body. There's not a sort of a church list or something that they can take your name off of. So they have limited. I mean, that's part of the strength of Islam and part of the weaknesses, or the weakness of Islam. It seems to me it's like a big, huge stream that is very hard to turn. It can't be easily hijacked completely, but it can't be turned and reformed in an easy way either. You know, in the Roman Catholic Church, if you go into a town and you say, who's the head Catholic in this town? It would be easy to find out. The priest, the bishop, the archbishop. The chain of command is fairly clear. If you go into a town and say, who's the chief Muslim here? It doesn't mean anything. It's sort of like asking, who's the chief Protestant here? There isn't a hierarchy. You can't say, well, the Uniting Church, pastor has his authority over the pastors of the other church or something like that. There is no organization, and so it's very difficult for them to cope with this. They are used to having an organization that was state-based in the Middle East. The state was the patron, or the caliph, or the sultan, or whatever, and he would have authority to deal with things. But in the West, people just set up a mosque. Anyone can do it. I was talking with a Muslim leader just today who was complaining that anybody can open up a mosque. They don't have to be trained to do it. They don't have to know what they're talking about. They might be fire-breathing lunatics, and they can do it. You can't stop them. But it's like any Protestant who can set up a church. And a priest who set up a church on his own, I think, would have someone to answer to. But a Protestant pastor can do anything he wants. And so it's difficult to know. They do need, it seems to me very clearly, to be aware that there's a threat of terror, and I think they are, a threat of terrorism in their midst. But how to deal with it, I don't think they've decided. And there are more Muslims than I would wish who are a little bit sympathetic. Not as many as the critics think, but more than I would wish. At least they say, well, I don't really agree with what he did, but I understand the grievance. I understand why he's upset. And so there's that minimal amount of support there. But it's going to be a long, long struggle, because this is not something where you can say, we finished the job on Tuesday. You're going to be constantly having to deal with the threat of Islamist crazies out there. I'll tell you a story that sort of inspires me. I'm sort of playing around with what you ask because I don't have a really good, clear, decisive answer to it. One of my heroes is a man who teaches law, actually, at UCLA, by the name of Khalid Abu Fadl. And he's a Muslim. He was of Egyptian descent living in Kuwait. And here's the story he tells. He went to Kuwait and he came under the spell of a fire-breathing radical imam. And he asked his father if he could join this imam's youth group. And his father said, sure, after a month. In the meantime, I want you to study with my friend Sheikh so-and-so, who was a very humane, moderate person. Well, young Khalid, never did join the radical youth group because he fell in love with the teaching of this more moderate man. That, I think, is the kind of thing that has to be done over and over and over again, is to teach Islamic youth that you can be seriously Muslim without going that direction. There's a richer heritage in your tradition than that. Osama bin Laden hiding in the mountains of Tora Bora is not the way Islam became great. That's not reverting to the original pattern. That's a mistake, a serious mistake. But it's a matter of one by one teaching the upcoming generation that who want to be serious about their faith, but they don't have too many good models for it. That there are other models they can choose. That's actually one of the benefits, I think, of this Islamic translation series that we launched, which is to show there's a rich tradition out there, and it has nothing to do with the crazies. It's a very, very intense and deep tradition, and it's enough to satisfy anybody if you'll pay attention. Anyway. Oh, thank you.
May I first of all thank our physical facilities people here at Notre Dame for the help they have given us in ensuring the ground floor at Building 15 on Shepherd Street was ready for our lecture today. I note in particular that Todd Scheller has repainted some of the walls because the students are so rough and damaged them. And I also want to thank his wife Maria, Pollock and Rebecca, and she's here tonight to hear this, not always, for all the work they have done in ensuring that our event went smoothly. That included not only the brochure announcing the event, but being the voice on the end of the phone to answer the queries, and the fingers on the keyboard who acknowledged when you confirmed you wanted to be here tonight. I also want to thank Paul Winkler, who volunteered to record this event so that several who could not attend could nonetheless know what transpired. Please join me in thanking our admin and physical facilities teams, as well as Paul, for all the work they've done to enable this event. And I put Notre Dame up there for a minute. I'm not sure when the idea that Dan might deliver our 7th annual Religious Liberty Lecture was conceived in our minds. I know that seeds of the idea were planted when my colleague here at Notre Dame, Nicholas Augustinus, arranged for Dan and I to tour the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, Istanbul, together back in 2015. But I think it goes back a lot further than that. In fact, to 2006, which was either Dan's first or second visit to Australia. On that occasion, and he's shown you this slide already, I learned of his Middle Eastern Texts Initiative and was able to help assist and to participate in the presentation of some of those texts to various institutions here in Sydney. For me, that project is a window into the charity that exists in this man's soul. The idea germinated in his mind in the 1990s, the early 1990s, though it began as an idea when he was in graduate school more than a decade earlier. In the 1990s, he proposed that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as BYU's sponsor, would support the translation and publication of leading texts in Arabic that have blessed the world and which have enabled the Western Enlightenment. But it took a while to get moving because funds needed to be raised, a full-time series production editor needed to be hired, and relationships had to be established with press and a distributor, and there needed to be a number of peer reviewers identified. The first book in the series was a bilingual edition of Al-Ghazali's The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which was published down in 1997. Among other things, the series as a whole made primary texts of classical Islamic civilization available in excellent, reasonably priced bilingual editions. The intent was to provide them cheaply enough that university teachers could prescribe them as classroom texts. But it also supported BYU's own emphasis, which included 6-month student internships in Amman, Jordan, and includes a strong Near Eastern Studies department at its Jerusalem Centre on Mount Scopus in the Arab Quarter of Jerusalem in Israel. Having met Dan on that first trip, I continued to be a Dan watcher, one of the good ones. I read his book, Muhammad, Prophet of God, as soon as it was published in 2007, and have shared my copy with a number of others. Sorry, Dan, I know that has not helped the prophets. I marvelled how much this one man could fit into his life when he also served in various roles as chairman of what became BYU's Neil A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship, and I knew he was also the editor of the Farms Review, which was the periodical produced for the Foundation of Ancient Research and Mormon Studies. Indeed, I came to regard him as something of a polymath because I did not see how Near Eastern, Islamic and Mormon studies could fit together, although I realised they do have a common thread in religious history, which I also shared at a more elementary level without the ancient Greek, Hebrew and Arabic competencies which I have coveted. But my connection with Dan has probably blossomed the most because he included my religious testimony on his Mormon Scholars Testify website while I was working in Africa in 2010, and then he took an interest in some of my work in law and religion and published some of my pieces in another peer-reviewed journal which he established in 2012, which is called Interpreter, a journal of Mormon scripture. For me, we could not talk continue to talk seriously about religious freedom in this annual lecture series without addressing the subject of Islam in Australia. Though its adherents only represent 2.6% of our population in the 2016 census, there is not a day goes by when their faith is not featured in our media headlines. Because of my interest in law and religion, I've developed friendships with people of Islamic faith all over the world. I'm delighted that one of my graduate Islamic students, one of ours, is here tonight. I marvelled, for example, despite the recent terrorism of Boko Haram in Nigeria, when I lived in West Africa, how well the almost equally divided Christian and Islam populations of Nigeria and Ghana coexisted and so easily communicated with and understood one another. But I was also deeply aware of the fear that the very word Islam evoked in friends attending congregations of my own church in Australia and the United States, as well as other countries around the world where the numbers of people who faithfully follow Islamic faith are smaller. I knew that fear firsthand because I had hosted an interfaith cocktail function at my then home in the Bible Belt of Sydney in 2002, which was attended by my friend Ali Rood, with whom Dan and Elder Dudfield and Debbie and I had lunch today, and Sheikh Yahya Safi, when an unknown neighbour of mine, while they were in my home, pelted it with eggs while we were truly enjoying each other's company inside. I also remember a road trip through South Africa, Namibia and Botswana with volunteer helpers where we discussed Islam extensively, but I could not persuade a dear friend that I did not know personally a single person of Islamic faith that I would not trust with my life, and I included Ali. Ali Rood is one of those. However, I knew I was not a sufficient authority to present the message that it is hypocritical to want religious freedom, but only for me and my house. While I believe it, and while I believe I can prove it in open-minded discussion, I knew that someone with better experience and reputation was required to provide that message at Notre Dame. And so I thought of Dan and Debbie. We began these discussions more than a year ago, and then Debbie perfected them. While we did not have a fixed time for our annual lecture, we needed to sync our calendars and choose a time when Dan and Debbie could come, free of pre-existing international and classroom commitments. There are some ways in which this time is not ideal. Since our strong supporters, the St Thomas More Law Society, had their annual Christmas party tonight, so that some of our people could not be here. But in other ways, the timing is more serendipitous than we could have planned, manifesting that God's invisible hand does watch over and prosper some of the very things we try weekly, but with high endeavour to accomplish here at the School of Law at Notre Dame. That serendipity includes, but is not limited to, the fact that the Ruddock Commission still has not released its Religious Liberty Report, which is accordingly going to make religious liberty an issue of some kind at our next federal election. And it includes the fact that Burke Street, Melbourne continues in our consciousness as a place of Islamic atrocity, even though the first offender was Demetrius Gargasoulas, who is a Greek Tongan, and among other things believed that he is the Christian Messiah. He was the one who went on the car in the old red Commodore. Why did that event get called Islamic? Because one bystander told the news media he had called out Allahu Akbar, which he didn't. Pauline Hanson then called it a terrorist attack. She's, of course, the most wise sage in Australia. And it went viral. Dan is the authority. I am grateful that he and Debbie agreed to come and have been so generous with their time in not only speaking here tonight, but in giving radio interviews and visiting with other members of the interfaith community here in Sydney. I just wish we could provide them with some additional hospitality before they return to the US after events in Melbourne later this week. Thank you, Dan and Debbie. Now, I know that there are still some refreshments left over out there. I also know that Dan will be happy to answer one or two of those hands that were up that didn't get to ask their questions. But again, thank you.